The sound of the television warming up was unmistakable, a gentle hum that grew louder as the tubes inside came to life, followed by the slow emergence of light in the center of the black screen. Margaret adjusted the rabbit ears one more time, tilting the antenna until the snowy static cleared and the familiar logo of CBC appeared crisp and clear in the living room of their modest bungalow on Elm Street. It was 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in 1973, and the Patterson family was settling in for their nightly ritual. The supper dishes had been cleared from the kitchen table, homework was spread across the dining room for later attention, and now the family was gathering in the living room for what had become as predictable and comforting as any other daily routine. The television itself was a handsome piece of furniture, a large wooden console that commanded respect and occupied a place of honor against the far wall of the living room. Its screen was modest by later standards, perhaps 21 inches, but in this room it seemed enormous, a window into worlds that existed far beyond the boundaries of their small Canadian town. Jim Patterson settled into his recliner, the one piece of furniture in the house that was understood to be exclusively his during evening viewing hours. He had changed out of his work clothes into comfortable slacks and a cardigan, and he held in his hand the evening paper that he would read during commercial breaks. The television guide was folded to Tuesday's listings, though he could probably recite the evening's programming from memory. His wife Margaret took her place on the sofa, bringing with her the mending basket that would keep her hands busy during the slower parts of whatever they decided to watch. Their daughter Linda, 16 and perpetually torn between wanting to be with the family and wanting to be anywhere else, curled up on the floor with her back against the sofa, close enough to her mother to feel connected but positioned so she could escape to her room if the programming proved too boring. 12-year-old David had claimed the ottoman, from which he could reach the television when channel changing became necessary. This was an important responsibility in a house where the remote control was still a thing of science fiction, where changing channels meant getting up, walking to the set, and turning the dial with a satisfying click that could be heard throughout the room. The choices before them were delightfully simple. Channel 4 was CBC, reliable and familiar, offering news, variety shows, and the kinds of wholesome programming that Canadian families could count on. Channel 7 brought them CTV, with its mix of American imports and Canadian productions that felt just slightly more adventurous than their public broadcasting counterpart. Channel 11 was the local station, offering community programming, local news, and sometimes surprising gems that couldn't be found anywhere else. That was it. 3 channels, 3 choices. In a world that would one day offer hundreds of options, this simplicity felt like abundance rather than limitation. "What's on tonight?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. This question was part of the ritual, a way of opening the discussion about how they would spend their evening together. Jim consulted the television guide with the seriousness of a man planning an important journey. CBC has that variety show at 8, the one with the singing group from Montreal. CTV has a movie, looks like it's that Western with John Wayne we saw advertised. And Channel 11, he paused, adjusting his glasses to read the small print. Channel 11 has local news until 8, then some documentary about farming in Saskatchewan. The negotiation that followed was gentle and democratic, involving consideration of everyone's preferences and the family's unspoken viewing hierarchy. Jim's opinions carried weight because he worked hard all day and deserved to relax with programs he enjoyed. Margaret's preferences mattered because she managed the household and rarely asked for much for herself. The children could voice their opinions, but they understood that adult preferences generally took precedence, especially on school nights. "I wouldn't mind seeing that variety show," Margaret said, looking up from the sock she was darning. "They always have such lovely music." Linda made a face that suggested variety shows ranked somewhere below homework on her list of preferred evening activities, but she didn't protest. At 16, she was beginning to understand that family harmony sometimes required small sacrifices, and an hour of music and comedy seemed a reasonable price to pay for the warmth of being together. David, ever practical, pointed out that the Western didn't start until 8:30, which meant they could watch the variety show and then switch to the movie if it turned out to be boring. This kind of strategic programming planning was part of the art of 3-channel living, requiring families to think ahead, to plan their evening's entertainment with the care that later generations would reserve for much more important decisions. "That sounds like a good compromise," Jim agreed, folding his newspaper and settling back in his chair. "We'll start with CBC and see how it goes." David walked to the television and turned the dial to Channel 4, the click of the selector loud in the quiet living room. The picture flickered for a moment, then settled into sharp focus, revealing the opening credits of a show that promised an hour of music, comedy, and the kind of wholesome entertainment that felt perfectly suited to a Tuesday evening in a Canadian living room. The show that unfolded over the next hour was exactly what they had expected. A carefully planned variety program featuring singers, comedians, and performers who delivered entertainment that was polished, professional, and designed to appeal to families just like theirs. There were musical numbers that made Margaret smile, comedy sketches that drew chuckles from Jim, and performances by young singers that reminded Linda that not all television was designed exclusively for her parents' generation. During commercial breaks, the family's conversation meandered through the events of their day. Jim mentioned a problem at work that had been resolved. Margaret talked about her visit with Mrs. Henderson next door. Linda shared news from school that was carefully edited to include only the parts she thought her parents should know. David reported on his progress with a model airplane he was building, a project that had been occupying his free time for weeks. These commercial break conversations were as much a part of the television watching experience as the programming itself. Unlike later eras when commercial breaks would send family members scattering to bathrooms and kitchens, in the three-channel era these interruptions provided natural discussion periods, times when the family could reconnect with each other while remaining gathered around the warm glow of the television screen. When the variety show ended at 8 o'clock, the question of what to watch next became more complex. Jim was interested in the Western, but Margaret had developed a headache during the day and wasn't sure she was up for cowboys and gunfights. Linda suggested they try the documentary on Channel 11, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly because she knew it would be less appealing to David, giving her some leverage in future viewing negotiations. The documentary turned out to be a revelation, a quietly fascinating exploration of wheat farming on the prairies, featuring interviews with farmers who spoke with the kind of deep knowledge that comes from generations of working the land. It wasn't exciting in any conventional sense, but it was real and immediate, and somehow exactly right for a Tuesday evening when the family was content to be together without needing to be thrilled or amazed. Jim found himself drawn into the farmers' discussions of weather patterns and crop rotation, subjects that connected to his own memories of growing up in rural Alberta. Margaret appreciated the program's gentle pace and the obvious respect it showed for the people it featured. Even Linda discovered that she was interested in the economics of grain production, though she would have been embarrassed to admit this to her friends at school. David, less interested in agricultural economics than the rest of his family, occupied himself with sketching in a notebook, occasionally looking up when something on the screen caught his attention. This was perfectly acceptable behavior during family television time. Not everyone needed to be equally engaged with every program, but everyone was expected to remain part of the gathering unless specifically excused. At 9 o'clock, the local news came on, bringing updates on city council meetings, high school sports scores, and weather forecasts that actually mattered because they affected people's daily lives. The newscaster was a man they had been watching for years, someone who felt more like a neighbor than a distant television personality. His delivery was calm and authoritative, and his obvious familiarity with local issues made the news feel personal and immediate. During the weather segment, Jim and Margaret discussed the forecast's implications for the weekend's plans. They had been thinking about driving to the lake on Saturday, but if rain was expected, they might postpone the trip or plan indoor activities instead. These kinds of decisions, simple, domestic, connected to the rhythms of family life, were made easier when weather forecasters were local people who understood the particular conditions and concerns of your specific area. As the evening progressed toward 10 o'clock, the question arose of what to watch during the final hour before bedtime. CBC was offering a drama that looked promising but serious. CTV had a talk show that might provide some laughs before sleep. Channel 11 would soon sign off for the evening with the national anthem, as it did every night at 10:30. The decision was made to try the drama, partly because it was Canadian-produced, and partly because the evening had been so pleasant that no one wanted to risk changing the mood with something that might prove disappointing. David was sent to bed at 10, as he was on school nights, but not before he had helped choose the program and settled in for the first few minutes to see what it was about. The drama turned out to be a thoughtful story about a family facing difficult choices during the Depression, the kind of program that television could do well when it took its time and trusted its audience to appreciate good storytelling. Jim and Margaret became absorbed in the characters and their struggles, seeing in them reflections of their own families' histories and the challenges their parents and grandparents had faced. Linda, who had initially planned to escape to her room and the privacy of her transistor radio, found herself drawn into the story as well. The family in the drama was dealing with problems that felt real and immediate, and the way they talked to each other reminded her of conversations she had overheard between her parents when they thought she wasn't listening. At 10:30, Channel 11 signed off with the playing of "O Canada," the familiar melody filling the living room as the Canadian flag appeared on the screen. This nightly ritual marked the end of broadcast programming on their local station, a reminder that television was not an endless river of content, but a finite resource that began and ended according to schedules that reflected the rhythms of daily life. The CBC drama continued until 11, at which point the family's evening viewing came to a natural conclusion. Jim turned off the television, the screen shrinking to a bright dot before disappearing entirely, leaving the living room in the warm glow of table lamps. Margaret gathered her mending, Linda collected her school books, and the family dispersed to their individual evening routines, reading, bathing, preparing for tomorrow's responsibilities. But the shared experience of the evening remained with each of them as they moved through their bedtime preparations. They had spent 3 hours together, watching programs they had chosen collectively, talking during commercial breaks, sharing reactions and opinions about what they had seen. Without planning or effort, they had created another in a long series of family memories built around the simple act of watching television together. This was the gift of three-channel television, not just the programs themselves, but the way those programs brought families together around shared experiences. When choices were limited, decisions became collaborative. When programming ended, families were encouraged to find other ways to spend their time together. When everyone was watching the same shows, conversations at work and school had common reference points that connected communities in ways that infinite choice would later make impossible. In the days and weeks that followed, the Patterson family would refer back to that Tuesday evening's viewing. Jim would mention something from the farming documentary during a conversation with a colleague. Margaret would hum a song from the variety show while doing housework. Linda would think about the Depression-era drama when studying Canadian history at school. These shared cultural touchstones created connections that went far beyond individual entertainment preferences. When most families were watching the same programs, television created a kind of national conversation, a set of common experiences that helped bind communities together across differences of age, background, and circumstance. The three-channel era represented more than just a different approach to television programming. It embodied a different understanding of how entertainment could serve families and communities. When options were limited, the focus shifted from finding the perfect program to making the best of what was available. When programming schedules were fixed, families learned to plan their evenings around shared viewing experiences. When commercial breaks provided natural conversation periods, television became a catalyst for family interaction rather than a substitute for it. Years later, when the Patterson children had families of their own and television offered hundreds of channels, they would remember those Tuesday evenings with a mixture of nostalgia and appreciation. They would remember the gentle negotiations over what to watch, the comfortable rhythm of programs and conversation, the sense of security that came from knowing that whatever they chose to watch, they would be watching it together. The era of three-channel television taught families how to compromise, how to find entertainment in unexpected places, how to create meaningful experiences out of simple shared activities. It was a time when the phrase "there's nothing on" was virtually unknown, because the expectation was not that television would provide perfect entertainment, but that families would create their own perfect evenings from whatever programming was available. This was the true magic of three-channel television, not the programs themselves, but the way those programs served as the foundation for family time, conversation, and connection that would be remembered long after the specific shows were forgotten.